Session 1 is going to focus on end state and site closure. Our first speaker is Mr. Mike Truex from PNNL. Great, Mike, you got a lot of fans here, looks like. Mike has 26 years of experience at PNNL, environmental remediation research and field applications. His experience includes work at the DOE, DOD, and the private sectors. Mike has also authored multiple technical guidance documents on remediation access strategies, monitored natural attenuation, vital zone contaminant transport, and the development of conceptual models. Mike also led chapter development and serves as a trainer for the Interstate Technology and Regulatory Council, ITRC, Remediation Management and Complex Sites document. He is also chairing the IEA Determination of Environmental Remediation End State documents. With that, Mike.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks, Ming. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the context around developing exit strategies and end states and some of the sort of recent publications that have come out that I think are helpful to the community in articulating why we need to think in this way. I'll give you some examples of some exit strategies that we've been working on and that and importantly how we've been taking the next step of developing a guidance related to exit strategies, but then how do we apply that at a site? So I think that's an important transition to talk about. I'll talk just briefly about monitoring considerations because those are so intimately entwined with exit strategies and end states, and so I don't want to neglect it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because it's a presentation into itself, but I think it's important. And then I'll end with some work that we're just in the process of with the IAEA in developing an end state document that I think might be of interest to folks here. So with that, in terms of context, you know, we've always known that remediation is challenging, but I think recently there have been these documents that try and articulate that in a way that says, hey, we have to think about these and how we make our decisions. And so in 2013, the National Research Council put out their document talking about the challenges at the nation's sites. And then recently, this ITRC document on remediation management of complex sites has come out. Again, I think importantly, noting that we have challenges, but then pointing to how we might address those. And I think end states and exit strategies are a component of that. A lot of these documents that have come out recently talk about the process of remediation. And so back in 2012, there was a document talking about monitoring. And I think importantly on this bottom part here, it talked a lot about this idea that remediation evolves with time, right? And so as we remediate, we learn new things, and we have to respond to that in how we monitor and how we make decisions. So I think that was a kind of a good articulation of that process. And then the ITRC document talks about this idea of adaptive management. And so how do we, if we have a site that's challenging and we can't say, oh, here's the one thing I'm going to do and I'm going to be done with it after I do this one thing. If I can't apply that sort of process, how do I adapt? And of course, that's closely linked to how you set objectives, both those interim objectives as you go along the way, but it really is also very importantly focused on a final objective. So it is related to this end state because you have to have that in mind as you pick those steps along the way. So I think that's important. And in fact, adaptive management, recently the EPA Superfund Task Force has really emphasized this idea of adaptive management. But I think if you look at, again, some of their publications, they really say, well, you still have to have that target in mind. And so that's where I think talking about challenges is good, talking about ways like adaptive management to address that is good, but you always have to think about the exit strategy or the end state as your ultimate target. So that's kind of where we're going to lead to. And this is just sort of a blow-up of the ITRC flow chart here. And again, it talks about these adaptive approaches when there are site complexities and this need for a stepwise approach, gaining information along the way, but it's really has to have these targets in mind so you have a path to closure. And we know that that's an emphasis and that we need to pay attention to that. So how do we go about that process? So with many of these activities for remediation, we may start with an active process, and we have to think about how do we meet those performance objectives. But importantly, we'll also have to be linking forward about how we're going to be transitioning to the ultimate end state and maybe a more passive approach. So it's always that sort of progression that we need to think about. So again, this idea of an exit strategy in mind all the time, even when you start thinking about performance objectives, how do we monitor during that process is important. And then what does that really look like at the end? And sometimes that's difficult to articulate up front, but we have to do a good job of that so we have that target in mind. That doesn't mean it can't change somewhat as you learn, as you progress, but we have to have that in mind as we think about this remediation management as opposed to one step and you're done. So I'll give you a couple examples of exit strategies that we've worked on recently. And what I want to focus on here is, you know, the ultimate question. So in this first strategy, we talk about soil vapor extraction. And so the ultimate question is, well, when can we stop with that system? But really we have to look at those underlying questions, and that's what we have to try and articulate in an exit strategy. So with soil vapor extraction, the ultimate question for shutdown relates to, we know that we're not going to get every drop of contaminant out of the subsurface. That's not going to be feasible. So the question is, if I have some persistent contamination, some amount that's going to remain behind, how much can I leave and still be protective relative to vapor intrusion or groundwater impact, which are my ultimate pathways for exposure? And so in the guidance document, what we tried to do is say, well, if our ultimate question is how can we transition or close SVE, we have to answer these questions, which are ultimately transport questions. If I have a certain amount of contamination here, what transport processes tell me what the concentrations are at my locations of interest? So that's the purpose of an exit strategy, is to define how do I answer those questions. With pump and treat, we wrote a similar document, and it has a more complex set of questions that goes with that idea of when can I shut off, pump and treat, or transition. Well, you may have multiple types of questions you have to answer. So these exit strategies, as a guidance document, line out those questions and the resources to help answer those questions, realizing there's always going to be a site-specific answer. So it's a process-based approach. And then we have to get to how we apply that at a site. So I'll give this example. At the Hanford site, we had been operating a soil vapor extraction system for about 20 years. We kept getting mass out. Every time we turned on the system, we were operating in a cyclic manner. So the question was, how much can we leave and still be protective? Well, the site went through and looked at this document, and then they developed their own flow chart of the type of information they were going to collect at that site and make sure they had a good CSM, looking at their regulatory requirements carefully to make sure that we had those in mind and how to answer those, and then went through with the testing to show whether or not we had a situation that said we can go ahead and close. So that translation written in these DOE documents was how we took this guidance document and applied it. And I think as a community, we have to think about, one, when we write those guidance documents, that we have that path to application. Similarly, with pump and treat, we have a document that we wrote about that, and it talks about these questions that you're ultimately going to be asking yourself when you get to the point of closure. We're not ready for that yet at Hanford. We just embarked on that 5 years ago. We have a horizon that we still have to do active treatment in our pump and treat system. But along the way, we know we're going to have questions in 20 years or 25 years that we're going to have to answer. So we went through and we said, well, as we go along, we linked our monitoring to those types of data we're going to have in the future. And we linked those to decision statements that relate to our data quality objectives as we go for both performance and for closure. We know we're going to have to calculate certain things about how that plume's responding. We're going to have to compare that to predictions. We're going to have to articulate what we found so we can report that to our regulators and internally to folks that have to make the decisions. And then we have to use that information to optimize. So ultimately, we had to set up our performance monitoring plan with that exit strategy in mind. And so that's another use of these guidance documents, is how do you manage remediation along the way. So those are a couple of examples as we talk about exit strategies. And up front I said, well, and as we just saw, monitoring is an important component of that. That's our feedback. That's what supports our decisions. And so this really grew out of this idea from the the earlier 2012 document on this idea that monitoring has to evolve over time, but that I think the challenge for us now is looking at, so this is just a diagram that shows different types of monitoring that you might do at a Veda zone site. Everything from remote monitoring to surface-based geophysics to cross-hole geophysics to different types of things you can do in a borehole. And so there's all those pieces out there, but the real key is, well, how do we put those together in a systems approach that feeds the types of questions we have to answer? And so we've been working on, well, how do we make companion ways for us to think about monitoring that are companions to exit strategies and end states, because that's ultimately monitoring is ultimately the way we're going to feed those decisions. So I think it's an important aspect. Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about this today because that's another presentation on its own, but I think it's something we always have to keep in mind. What is that information base that feeds our decisions? So I'm going to move on now to sort of the last part of my presentation to talk about current activities we have with the IAEA. And a couple of years ago, their member states came to the IAEA and they said, look, we've got all different kinds of sites with radiological contamination, and we really have a problem here in trying to articulate what's the end state of those sites going to be, because that will be used ultimately to help us define what activities we're going to take at those sites. So that was the charter that the IAEA was given. And so their response was this Determination of Environmental Remediation End States document, which I'll use the acronym DERES to identify. And so this is intended as a resource and a guide for determining end states for environmental remediation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the scope of that later. But the intended audience for this document is really sort of everybody that's involved. So it's not a document that says here's specific technologies and a specific plan. It's that first step of thinking about how do I talk with all the site decision makers and the stakeholders about where I want to be and what processes might get me there, so you can balance what's the best option to embark upon. So that's the level of document we're talking about. So it's truly a high-level end state document. And so the scope of this is, because it's related to decisions, it's a process document, right? We don't know the site-specific information, so we're going to talk about what process do you use to determine an end state. And in this, it's really focused on environmental remediation, but of course, as part of that, you may have facilities that are associated with that. So in that way, it links to decommissioning sorts of activities. And it is focused a lot on reduction or mitigation of radiological risk, but because these sites typically have mixed contamination, it also has to deal with the fact that there may be other factors that have to come into play other than just radiological risks. And then really we're talking about an end state, but that is very intimately linked with this idea of the intended future use. And that's a key element of, as we talk about the end state, what is your future use, how does that relate to how you want this site to be used, but then what are the relative options in terms of balancing the risks and what you might leave at a site versus how you're going to change a site to reach an end state. So this idea of intended future use is sort of a big element of what we put into this document. It may be relevant at some decommissioning sites, although many of those sites have decommissioning plans already in place that define that process. And it may be useful at naturally occurring radiological material sites, although that's not the main focus of the document. And like I said up front, it's really at this high level, this process of decision making. It's not for specific technologies or specific plans, but again, it's that first thing you have to do to establish the target so you know how those processes should be designed in order to reach that target. So that's the scope of the document. So I'll just kind of walk through the current content, and this is a document in process, so I'll be able to tell you what we're aiming for the content, but we have a broad group of people that are working on this right now. But one of the things we wanted to start out with the definition of terms, because the main point of this document is to aid in communication, right? So let's have some terms on the table so we know how we can talk with everybody that might be involved in that decision, stakeholders to site regulators to site owners. It focuses on a flow chart because, again, it's a process-based document that talks about the types of decisions that are important. We need to link to resources, though. How do you make those decisions? So what are your resources to make those decisions? And then how do you involve stakeholders along the way? So again, because this is a process document, we need to talk about that. It does talk a lot about the idea of optimization approaches, where while we understand that we may have some strict requirements that need to be met, there's always this balance of risk within meeting those requirements. So it talks about optimization and how you might articulate the different options for end states so you can do a cost and benefit analysis and look at a balance of risk. Many times these sites have many different types of aspects that are all risks. So how do you blend those in terms of determining the best overall approach for that end state? The document also talks about uncertainties, and it talks about those in terms of how you make decisions. So it's there's many different aspects to uncertainties, but clearly when you make decisions, you may have limited information, and you may make those based on predicted performance of remedies. And so when you're talking with a group of decision makers and stakeholders, you need to clearly say, well, we know we have these uncertainties. We have to make certain decisions to take a step forward. And we know we have some uncertainties with that step forward, but we have to get started. And so here's how we're going to do that. So the document does talk about the potential for interim states or adaptive state steps if you can't fully articulate what that outcome might look like at the onset. So it's kind of compatible in a way with the ITRC document in that aspect. We talk a lot about the whole life cycle, and that's important when you talk about an end state, because certain end states have a different administrative or monitoring burden than another one might have for a long term, and you need to think about that in conjunction with the short-term aspects of a site. So we bring out that. And then importantly, we talk about how do you document this end state plan, because this is the first step, and you need to document it because then it will tier down to development of those specific remediation plans or decommissioning plans associated with it. And we know it's going to have to be living over time, so you need to make sure you document this, because 10 or 20 years from now, the same people may not be there anymore, so we need to think about how we document for the future implementers. So that's some of the content. So basically that's an outline of the document content. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the key elements of it, and then I'll talk through the flow chart a bit. So one thing to note is within the IAEA, they identify emergency, existing, and planned exposure situations. So this particular document on end state is not an emergency response document, so it would be applied after that emergency response was done. When you get into what they call these existing exposure situations, where we know we have an existing contaminant issue and we have to take some action, and so this is a document to guide that. It does not necessarily apply to a planned exposure system situation, because that may already have a decommissioning plan in place, but it could relate to that, because you may have a site where you have a facility that has a plan, but the overall site may not have that same decommissioning plan. So again, that's how we relate to these situations, but this is the primary target of the document. And also it's important to note, so the IAEA has a whole portfolio of documents related to radiological sites, and this document needs to be written in conjunction with what those other documents say. So like the principles of radiation protection and risk and exposure limits, we're writing our document to be a companion to all of those. And so as we go forward, those resources and links are within this current DRA's document. I talked a little bit about the regulatory environment, and of course this is for the IAEA, so there's a wide range of member states that have different regulations, and those regulations vary from having prescriptive elements where we have very strict requirements. We have a certain dose, for instance, that off-site this has to be met, but then there's always this idea of this balance of risks that may need to be taken into account, and different countries have different levels of comfort with how much goes into that balance of risk, but this document does talk about this idea of optimization and balance of risks, and it also talks about the context for the regulatory approach, and some the countries have different levels of how they articulate their regulations. So we talk about national strategies, international regulations, and then this idea of what's the role and how do stakeholders get involved in this overall process, given the fact that we have some prescriptive regulations, but we may have this balancing of risk. And that's this interplay of the regulations and the decision process. So in this document, we try to articulate that with the difficulty of not writing it for just one country. And so there's a little bit of give and take in terms of how we articulate that in this particular IAEA document. So now I'm going to kind of walk through at the last part of the presentation here and talk about the flow chart. And so this is the overall flow chart on this side. I realize that's probably not readable. I'm going to zoom in on certain sections here in the next couple slides. But this core here of the decision process and the types of actions is really built on first deciding that you have a need for action. So any site may have an identified hazard, but do you have a need for action? It focuses a lot on articulating the conceptual site model, because that's important, because that's your basis for how you then make your decisions. What do you know about a site? How do you make that decision? And then how do you develop and evaluate options? Along the side here are the elements that talk about what factors are important to consider in these decision processes, because remember, this is talking about that decision process and the people that are going to be at the table. It talks about the site-specific information that may need to be collected, and the types of analyses that would need to be done to support that. So that's the core of this IAEA document, is this flow chart. So when we look at the flow chart elements, so this is the first part of it. We clearly talk about this idea of identifying the need for action and when you might initiate that action. And this is important because this document may be used by different member states, and they may have a prioritization sort of approach to this, so they need to decide within the priorities. I might have a site that has a potential need for action, but when does that action take place in relationship to other sites? We talk a lot about the conceptual site model and identifying the challenges that are in place, because that's going to feed the decision process. And so we talk about that, but also importantly the confidence factors for how much information do you need to know about the site, how confident do you need to know what the situation is before you can take steps. And so that's something that's important for sites or for member states, because it depends on what sort of monetary funds do they have available to, how much characterization do you do before you take action is sort of the question there. And that's an important question. That's an important question for the United States. You know, do we need to characterize, how much do we characterize before we take that first step? And then we talk a lot about refining this conceptual model in terms of making sure we articulate what the site issue is relative to how we're going to think about benefits or consequences of actions. You know, what the balance of risks are. And so that's an important element as you go forward to decide what you're going to do and what that end state's going to look like. So that's sort of how we set up the first part of this flow chart. The second part of the flow chart gets into, now we're going to formulate these options in terms of potential end states and relate those to future use. So you may have a desire for your future use, like a UUUE sort of deal where we have a green field, but there are certain options that could fit into that, and those may be quite stringent requirements to get to that point. Well, what are the other options if you have a different future use, if you look at a different way that site might be used, so a brownfield sort of use. We talk a lot about, of those options, how we identify which ones are really sustainable. So that gets into this life cycle discussion. And then, of course, there's a process to evaluate options. And we try and talk about the holistic assessment because, again, it's always this balance of risks. You may have a desire for a certain use, but there's consequences for what it takes to get there. How many tons of earth do you have to move if you really want to get to that? And is that really where you want to be in a balance of risks sort of a scenario? And so this last part then talks about, okay, how do we go through this overall process, realizing we might have to loop back as we talk with our decision makers and stakeholders to finally get to an acceptable end state and approach where then you can move forward. And I cut it off here, but that last part is about the documentation. Then how do you document how you went through that process so everybody knows what your challenges are, how your decision addresses those challenges, and what the requirements are going to be for implementing that end state. That would be then what moves forward into developing the detailed plans to select technologies and do your remediation or decommissioning plan associated with the end state. So that's how we're currently working through this with the IAEA in terms of articulating how to develop end states for, again, this rather broad set of clients, so to speak, their member states. But hopefully that gave you a flavor for the current status of that document. And then at the end of this presentation, because it's available to you afterwards, I did put a number of the references that were used if you want to look those up. And with that, I'd be glad to take any questions.
So anybody has a question for Mike? I'm going to pass the
Yeah, Mike,
Yes.
very nice presentation, actually. This is, I just want to ask you just a couple of questions. I think I'll limit myself to one question. So we are talking about this IEA, and you try to say that what the other other countries are following and versus U.S. and those kind of things. What are the barriers you saw as far as U.S. is concerned? When I talk about the U.S. US's sites, so let me be specific. DOE facilities, okay. DOE themselves are engaged. They themselves are engaged in different treaties, different regulations, different tripartite agreements, and they themselves were part of the whole development of different decisions, like future site uses committee's recommendations for the Hanford sites. Then we have all those treaties and all kinds of things. And they said themselves, along with regulators, EPA, ecology, how to move forward in the past, okay? I mean, we're still looking at it. How do you compare that DOE's commitment or U.S. commitments versus the international commitments? Where are the barriers and how these documents will address, or what's your suggestions?
Well, I think fundamentally, the process you described, which identifies all the stakeholders and decision makers and the factors that relate to what that end state is and how that relates to how you take those steps in remediation, your actions, is similar to this. I think the challenge is similar to what we have in this document for the other member states, which is how do you balance the risk, make prioritization decisions, and then how do you look at prescriptive versus optimization approaches for your ultimate end states. And each entity, just like the United States, has to think about that in terms of balancing what the best path forward is. And I think the other element in here that's important, especially for the big DOE sites, is this idea of those interim steps or adaptive approaches, recognizing the difficulty in clearly envisioning the full path forward. And I think we have those challenges just like some of these other sites have it. The first part of the IAEA meeting, we had presentations from the member states that talked about their challenges. And in each one of those presentations, I could see elements of the challenges that we have. We've taken some steps forward already, and I think that's been I think that's a good thing to do because we've learned some things, but I think we should reflect on some of these processes and how we think about our path forward, because we've gone through these same things and we still have these decisions to make where we have to make these balancing and prioritization decisions. And I think that to me is the parallel. And this is one way that's being written down, and I think the U.S. and each site will have to think about that in their context. This document is not prescriptive. It is a process-based document. So I hope that in some way answers your question. Beth?
Beth Moore, Department of Energy. Thank you, Mike. That was an excellent talk. Really appreciate it. Two questions. Have we moved further down the way towards quantifying stakeholder input regarding our options rather than just holding meetings and listening to what people say? Quantifying their input as probability distributions and then incorporating them in the final decision. I'm interested in your what you've learned about that, not only nationally but also internationally. And I'd also like to ask you about, in including sustainability in this particular process, do you include equal weighting to the triple bottom line of all three elements? Or are we also are we still respecting EPA's recommendations regarding they pick the remediation process and then we green it under green and sustainable remediation?
Okay, so those are good questions. In terms of the stakeholder involvement, there is a subgroup in this IAEA that's going to talk about this idea of the processes for stakeholder involvement. And And so some folks from the UK have some good ideas on that. That's not my particular area, so I can't tell you all about what those specifically are, but your question is the same type of question that came up here is, in terms of stakeholder involvement, we can't just say, oh, we want that, and let's just make it happen, right? There have to be processes involved. And so what we're going to try and do in this document is try and articulate those different types of processes. And I think having some more quantitative or rigorous ways to articulate, okay, you've told us this, and here's how we're going to now take it and use it, and how we're going to do that in a way that's not so general that leaves an open ending. I think that's very important. So my basic answer is yes, we are paying attention to that. The IAEA will be looking at that. That's not something I can tell you the specifics. That's not my area. On the second question, in terms of sustainability, that is another part that we talked about there. It's a specific element of the flow chart. And so we are trying to think about that in terms of this balance of risks. It's always going to be tempered by the regulatory environment. So there'll be, again, the prescriptive elements versus the optimization or the balancing elements. And so that's going to be the challenge for that box in terms of sustainability, because if you look at the three legs of sustainability, they may not all be compatible with a prescriptive regulation, but they're all compatible with this idea of greening or the sustainability. So that element is what we're working on for that box. So your two questions are two key items that came up within the IAEA that we're trying to work on with this document. Now, it's in process, so again, I can't tell you the answer, but those are, I think, for the community, for us as we move forward, those are important elements because they relate to this ultimate question we have to answer if we're going to truly balance what the right decision is for all the factors involved. So good questions. I'm sorry I can't be very specific in answering, but they will be worked on.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for that.